Okay, so now that we have played around with the shapes and we've made some shapes, let's talk about what we can do with them. So let's take a look over here at the properties palette. So you'll notice that if nothing is selected, if I'm using my black selection arrow, which again should be your default tool all the time, and I click on the paper or I click on the gray space, so basically nothing is selected, you'll see that the properties palette pretty much has these default bits of information. This talks about the document size, the document itself, as well as how many artboards there are. It allows you to edit the artboards, which we'll get to in a little bit. It allows you to turn things on like rulers and grids and guides. So we'll get to all that in a little bit, but all of this information pertains to the document itself, not the objects on the document. Now, if I choose an object, like if I go ahead and choose the rectangle, click, and now the rectangle is active, you'll notice that the properties palette has completely changed, and it gives me information that is useful to that particular object. So like I said, it's kind of like a golf caddy palette, which is great. So you'll notice that there is a transform section here, which allows me to change the location of the object in relationship to the upper left corner of the page. But that's something you probably wouldn't use very much. But I can change the shape of the object. So let's say, for example, I wanted that rectangle to be exactly 5 inches long. I could go to the width, highlight it, type in 5, and hit Tab on my keyboard, and it becomes exactly 5 inches long. And you'll notice that the entire rectangle resized because they were linked together, right? Now, if I want to change the height of it, I can do that too. If I wanted the height to be exactly 3 inches, again, type it in there and it resizes it. So when you're first drawing the object, you're kind of just eyeballing it, right? But if you know you need your object to be an exact size, this is where you can go change it. And of course, if I wanted it to just become a square, I could just change the width to be the same as the height, 3 inches and 3 inches, and now it's a square. All right. Other things you can do is, of course, you can flip it around. So I'm going to go back to making it a rectangle here just by dragging it. And I'm going to put a little rotation on it just so you can tell the difference between the sides. So now if I go up here with it selected right below the width and the height, there is the reflection tools. There is flip horizontal and flip vertical. If I click flip horizontal, watch what happens to the rectangle. Flip, and flip vertical, flip. So it literally flips it on its X or Y axis. And if I wanted to adjust the angle of it, I can simply, instead of rotating it freely over here, I can go in and actually choose an angle from this pull-down menu. Make it 90 degrees, make it 30 degrees, make it 150 degrees, or you can go and type in what you want. So I'll make it 45 degrees and does that. So the transform section allows you to really fine-tune the tool. You can make the size very specific. You can flip it and reflect it. You can adjust the angle, so you can be really very sort of specific about what you are doing with it. Now, the next part is the appearance. Now, the appearance section takes care of exactly what you would think, the colors that are involved in it, as well as the opacity. So the first one is fill, which if you click on that, opens up a color picker. This is actually the swatch palette, which allows you to pick from a variety of pre-selected colors, these here, so I can switch it from a red rectangle to a blue or a green or whatever I want. And if I don't want to use the swatches, I can grab the color mixer by clicking this button, and then this allows me to sort of slide around the different color mixes. This is in CMYK mode, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. We talked about colors not too long ago. And now I can really fine-tune the color and mix it, or I can go down here to the color wheel and pick directly from there. Okay, so that's the fill, and then when you're done with it, you click back over here. And then, of course, the stroke is the outline color. So if I click on that, I can change it from a black stroke to, say, a blue stroke. But now, even though I'm happy with the color, it's too small, I can't see it. I can go over here to the size of the stroke and pick a larger stroke size. So now you can really see the size all the way around. So these are all preset sizes. I can make it a 10-point stroke. And if I want to type in the stroke amount that I want, if I wanted to make it something very specific, like say 12 points, I can do that, type it in, and hit Tab, and it sets it in. So that changes the appearance of the object. And the last part of the appearance is the opacity, how transparent it is, how much you can see through it. And to do that, you can simply grab the slider here and slide it downwards, and now you can see that I can make it more or less transparent, which over the white paper just seems to make it lighter. But if I pick it up and put it over another object like so, you can see that I can see through it now and see, in this case, the star behind it. So if I were to adjust the opacity here, you can see that I can make it more and more opaque until it's completely solid again. So that adjusts the transparency or the opacity of something, right? So that is part of your appearance. And then if you want to get into more detail on the stroke or the opacity, if you click on the names, you'll see that those are links which open up additional palettes which give you some more ability to change things. So for example, the stroke palette, not only can I do some of the same things, I can change the size, but I can round the edges of the stroke simply by clicking those buttons. So now they're rounded. I can also make it a dashed line by clicking off dashed line. So you can see that those are dashed now, and you can put in some numbers of the length of the dash, the length of the gap, and it changes that. And if this was not a shape, if it was just a solid line, you could add things like arrowheads to the ends of the line, either on the beginning or the end, so that could come in handy. And you can change the style of the line from a uniform line to a line that has a little personality to it, like these here. So you can play around with sort of the personality of the line by getting into the stroke palette. And similarly, the opacity palette also has some other options. Outside of changing the opacity, you'll notice that it has blending modes. Yes, they're back. You remember these from Photoshop, right? So blending modes, of course, allow you to change the way an object looks photographically over some other objects. Now, it's not quite as effective in Illustrator as it is in Photoshop, but they work roughly the same way. And you can certainly play around with them. Okay, the last part of the appearance section is the effects button. FX, say it quickly, effects. So if I click on that, it opens up a variety of sort of special effects you can add to the objects. And I'm not going to really demonstrate these now because it's really early in playing with Illustrator, but you are certainly welcome to play around with them. I will say that as interesting as some of these are, they do eat up a lot of memory and will slow down Illustrator quite a bit. So just be patient with them, but you can certainly play around with them, okay? All right, so that takes care of appearance. And then, of course, once you're done with that, you simply use your black selection arrow and click into the white space, and boom, it becomes set. Okay, then the next thing I want to show you is adding some features to the actual document. So again, in the Properties palette, if you have nothing selected, so if you have the black selection arrow and you just click onto the paper or onto the gray space, nothing is active. You'll notice that the Properties palette goes back to being all about the document itself. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to go down here to Ruler and Grid. These are going to give you some measurement tools that can come in handy when working in Illustrator. So by clicking on the Ruler button, it turns on the rulers. You'll see that there is a horizontal ruler. There is a vertical ruler. And you'll see that it is currently in inches. And if you want to change the unit of measure, there's a couple ways to do that. You can either go here to the Properties palette and go up here to Units and change it from inches to either points, picas, millimeters, centimeters, or pixels. Now, of course, if you're using the metric system, you would be interested in millimeters and centimeters. If you were designing for the web, you would be interested in pixels, because that's how we measure things on the web. And if you're interested in doing things in print, you would be interested in inches, picas, or points. Although, to be entirely honest, most people just use inches these days, unless you're doing a lot of desktop publishing, which we are not. So that can change the unit of measure. So you'll notice if I switch from inches to pixels, you'll see that the makeup of the ruler changes, and so now it measures everything in 100 pixel increments. So that is useful. And then the next thing we can turn on, I'm going to go back to inches actually, just because it's easier to demonstrate. We'll go back to inches. And then the next thing to turn on is the second button here, which is to show grid. So if I click that, you'll see that this grid appears in the background, which conforms to the ruler. Each major square is an inch, each smaller square is 1/8 of an inch, and so it gives you a measurement tool so that when you're laying objects onto the page, you can use the grid and the ruler to help line things up with each other. It really comes in handy when you're trying to be organized and make things in the exact right spot. So then the last part here is to deal with guides, which is down here underneath guides. And then this turns the guides on and off. But you're probably wondering, what's a guide? So guides you get from the rulers. So if you hover your mouse over the actual ruler and click and then drag downwards, you can pull out a guide, which are these turquoise colored lines, which allow you to put in some areas where you want to sort of cordon off some stuff. So I can use guides to sort of delineate some space so that when I pick up an object, for example, like my star, it'll sort of snap in place to where the guides are, which makes lining things up pretty easy, which is great. So now you can see the tip of the star is touching the guides perfectly. And if I shut off the grid here, you can see them a little more clearly. So guides are really great for helping you to sort of design a space, lay out an area, line things up. And then these buttons here allow you to turn the guides on or off. Now that doesn't delete them, it just makes them visible or invisible, so they can come in handy. And then the next possibility here is to lock the guides so that they can't go anywhere, you can't move them. So that's always a good idea, you want to do that. And then lastly here, you can click to turn smart guides on or off. Now smart guides you've been seeing all along as we move things around. It's all these purple lines that keep popping up that sort of tell you relationship information between items. Some people like them, some people don't like them. I find them particularly handy, but if you don't, you can always turn them off by clicking this button and they will go away. Okay, next we have snap options. So right now I can pick up an object and it moves freely around the board, right? I can just pick it up and move it anywhere I want. But if I have my grid on and I click this button here, it says snap to point, and then we have snap to grid, and then snap to pixel. There are different ways in which you can get your objects to basically not move freely, but to adhere themselves to certain areas. So if I click on the middle one, snap to grid, you'll see that if I pick up an object now and I move it, instead of it moving freely, it clicks every 1/8 of an inch. It'll move across the grid 1/8 of an inch at a time, which can come in handy. It allows you to sort of move things a little more purposely. And you can certainly try that out. They do come in handy. Now I will say that in manipulating objects in Illustrator and moving things around, you are definitely going to toggle around between having the snap to grid on and having it off, so it's neat to be able to have it handy here. And same thing with the grid, you're going to want that on and off sometimes. So sometimes you want it off, sometimes you want it on. It depends on what comes in handy for you. It makes things a little easier. So you can play around with that. Okay, and then the last thing I'm going to show you here in Illustrator is the Layers palette. Last thing I'm going to show you today. Now the Layers palette lives right next to the Properties palette, and of course you remember the Layers palette because we had one in Photoshop, and it's very important in Photoshop. In Illustrator, the Layers palette is super useful. It works roughly the same way as the one in Photoshop, but it's not quite as important to doing things. You'll notice that we made all these shapes, we changed colors, we moved things around, and not once did we really need the Layers palette. So it's not as important as it is in Photoshop. That being said, it is a functional tool that you can definitely put to good use. So here in the Layers palette in Illustrator, of course, you'll recognize some of it. You can turn the eyeball off and on to make things disappear or reappear. So that's super useful. And you'll notice that the layer is named just Layer 1, similar to Photoshop. So if I double click on it, I can name it something else, like Shapes. But then you'll notice there's only the one layer, and yet you're thinking, wait a minute, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 objects, but why do I only have one layer? Well, because Illustrator does not make new layers for every object. It makes what's called sub-layers for each object. So you'll notice that the layer next to its name and its thumbnail has a little tiny triangle. If I click that and fold it down, you'll see that those are all my sub-layers, which are all the objects on screen, including the guides. Even those turquoise guides get their own sub-layer. So there's one, 2, 3 guides, and then there's my rectangle, and you'll see it says rectangle, and you can see a little mini thumbnail of it. A star, it doesn't name it star, it just calls it path, I don't know why. Then polygon, and then ellipse. And of course, if you were to shut off the individual eyeballs, you can see that you can make each item go away, each sub-layer So in this way, it does work like Photoshop, but not so many layers, more sublayers. Now, the other interesting thing about the Illustrator Layers palette is that the last tool in Layers are these little balls on the right side. If I were to click on one of them, it turns the bounding box on that object. It activates it. It does the same thing as using the selection arrow to simply pick it visually. Now you might be thinking, well, that seems silly. If I can just click on the object, why do I need to choose it from the Layers palette? Well, if you had a really complex illustration, like something like this with a whole bunch of objects on it, or something even more complex than this, you would have a lot more sublayers. So for example, if we look at this illustration and I fold down the layers, you'll see that there are a ton of sublayers just to make the rocket. Those are all the shapes that make up the rocket image. And then these are all the shapes that make up the background image. So, it can get really complex. And so being able to click on a specific item can get difficult. And so being able to simply choose it from the list this way can certainly come in handy. But of course, back to our demonstration, we're just dealing with some basic shapes. So maybe this isn't super necessary, but you can totally see its potential. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to introduce you guys to in Illustrator today. We have the workspace, the toolbox, the way the artboards work, the way you can make some basic shapes, the properties palette and how that works, as well as the layers. Okay, so for this week, I want you to just play around with Illustrator, try out the functionality that we just demonstrated, continue to explore it and get used to it. Notice that there is an announcement under week 6, the week 6 announcement, which corresponds with introducing Illustrator, and there is a video listed how to get started with Adobe Illustrator, 10 things beginners need to know. So certainly watch that video. It'll give you even more tips and tricks that I probably did not go over, so you can play with a lot of that. There is nothing due this week other than to spend time exploring and playing with Illustrator and getting used to it as a piece of software. So I hope you have some fun with it, and I will pick up next week where we'll get into more functionality in Illustrator. All right, hope everybody's being safe, and I'll talk to you soon.